Well, Bill, you've been doing this for a long time. How long have you been doing it?
1962. You do the math. Well, I'll tell you who the first promoter I worked for. He was my boyhood hero, Joe Louis.
Yeah?
And I used to sit at the radio with my dad, and the only sport my dad cared about was boxing, and listen to Joe Louis fights. And so he was my hero, and he started promoting some fights in Hollywood at a nightclub, and that was my first job.
And then from there, what did you do?
Well, then a man named Leo Minskoff, who was a member of a family that was kind of a dynasty in New York. They were builders and property management people. As a matter of fact, there's still a Minskoff Theater that's a legitimate, musical theater in New York. He was the oldest of 5 sons, and he came to Beverly Hills and expanded the company to Beverly Hills. And my brother-in-law talked him into being a fight promoter, and I was hired as the publicist.
And then from that point, you went on to do what?
Well, not necessarily in this order, but I was Don King's first publicist.
Yeah.
When he first became a promoter. The great Eileen Eaton, who promoted for 40 years at the Olympic Auditorium weekly shows. I worked for her. I worked for Don Chargan. I've worked for Bob Arum since 1987. I've worked for pretty much every major promoter, in the last 40-something years.
Over that time, what are some of the great moments that you've been involved with?
Well, the greatest moment was I first met George Foreman when he was 18 years old and had 6 amateur fights. And I was the ring announcer, the publicist, what else did I do? Swept up at ringside, and so on at the fight. And in the ring comes George Foreman, the fighting corpsman. He was in the Job Corps. This happened in Oakland, California. And he had 6 fights and 6 knockouts. And I mean, 18 years old, he was green as grass. He had just started boxing amateur. He was a street fighter from the 5th Ward in Houston. And he fought that night a really professional amateur who was a college kid from Los Angeles, who had fought in international tournaments for a number of years and was really a very schooled amateur fighter, a boxer who was taller than George, etc. And George came out. It was a 3-round fight, 2-minute rounds, and George came out in the first round and threw everything. And because the kid was so skilled, he avoided being knocked out. And the second round, George had no gas. He spent all his gas in the first round. So the kid boxed his ears off in the second and third. It's Clay Hodges, I just remembered his name. So Clay Hodges boxed his ears off in the second and third round. Easiest fight in the world to score, 2-1. And then because we had a professional card, the law in California is you have to separate the amateurs from the professionals. So I made an announcement as the ring announcer that there will now be a 20-minute intermission, which meant it's really going to be 30 minutes. And I was roundly booed by the crowd, so there was no reason for me to stay in the ring. So I walked back to the dressing rooms, and here this young giant was sitting on the rubbing table, George, literally with his chin on his chest, just devastated. And I felt so sorry for him. I slapped him on the back and I said, "George, don't worry about it. You're going to be a good fighter someday," just to make him feel better. And then when he wrote his autobiography, By George, which was a bestseller, he wrote in the book, he said, there was this celebrity named Bill Caplan, and I lost my first fight, and I was going to quit boxing. I was never going to fight again. And so the celebrity came back, patted me on the back and said, "You're going to be a good fighter someday," and I believed him, so I decided not to quit. Well, when I read it, of course, this was 1994, and I met him in '67, before he went to the '68 Olympics. So all those years, again, you do the math, Carl, 67 to 94, I read the book, and I immediately hooked up with George at an HBO fight in Sacramento where he was doing the color, which he did for 12 years. I said, "George, why would you call me a celebrity? I'm anything but a celebrity." He says, "Well, you got to understand where I was coming from." He says, "From Houston's 5th Ward, and then the Job Corps in Pleasanton, California, and I had very little experience in anything except fighting in the streets and doing what kids do in the ghetto of Houston. He said, so to me you were a celebrity because, first of all, you were pointing your finger and telling everybody what to do, and you were wearing a tuxedo. So that made you a celebrity. So then I understood. And so for one fleeting moment in George's book, I was a celebrity.
There's a story I've often heard about you that you were...
Oh, Carl, to answer that question. So in 1994, after he had been retired for 10 years, something that no world-class professional athlete in any sport had ever done, any sport, and come back and competed world-class, and almost 20 years to the day that he had lost the fight in Zaire to Ali, his first loss, and I was with him over there for 2 months. Almost 20 years to the day, he knocked out the undefeated heavyweight champion, Michael Moore, who was the linear champion who had beaten Holyfield at age 45, which nobody has ever done anything close to 45 like that. He made history, so that was my biggest thrill in boxing.
When you were with him in Zaire, and then he suffered a cut and the fight got postponed, was that, I read that that was kind of a crazy time and they wouldn't let the fighters leave the country.
George wanted to leave and not come back.
Yeah.
He hated it there because Ali was a great cheerleader for himself and organized crowds, and he had him yelling Ali Boombaye, which meant Ali kill him. And you know, he was a master at psychological warfare, and George was very uncomfortable there, to the point where he had 6 Zaire Secret Service people armed surrounding him at all times when he wasn't in the ring working out or in the privacy of his quarters. And so he was very comfortable, and when he got cut, and it was a deep cut, he wanted to leave the country, and he said to the Secretary of State, who reported directly to the dictator, the president, Mobutu Sese Seko, he says, I want to go train in Paris, and I'll be back in 6 weeks. But they saw through that transparency, and they said, I'm sorry, George, you can't leave. And they didn't let him leave.
You think that affected him in the fight?
Oh, I think it affected him, but here again, similar story. George had knocked out Joe Frazier, who had beaten Ali in very convincing fashion, knocked him down 6 times in Jamaica in 2 rounds, and in the second round he actually picked him up off the floor, a very famous photograph, picked him up off the floor with a right hand uppercut. I mean, it was a devastating knockout, and Frazier was undefeated. And then in Caracas, we went to Caracas, and he defended against Kenny Norton, and Kenny Norton had just beaten Ali and broken his jaw in San Diego. And again, he almost knocked out Norton in the first round, and did in the second round, and he went down stiff, like, please forgive me, like he was nailed to the cross. And that's the way he went down. And he knocked out George Chavallo, who had an iron chin. He stopped him in 3 rounds. Nobody ever stopped Chavallo. So people were praying that Ali not be killed by George Foreman. And so what did George do? It was the rope-a-dope. And at the end of the second round, I saw my ample belly was pressed up against the ring, and I saw George at the end of the second round, his punches started to slow down, and I said out loud, oh my God, we're going to blow this fight. And sure enough, he ran out of gas, and progressively by the 8th round he had nothing left, and Ali clipped him a real good right hand. Ali was not a big puncher, he was a sharp puncher. Clipped him a good right hand, and George went down kind of in a spiral, and then he was getting up at the count of 10. But that's what happened. He had run out of gas. I mean, to Ali's credit, I mean, he was brilliant. But it shows about courses and horses and styles, because those heavyweights in the golden age of heavyweights, they beat each other. Norton with Ali beat him once. You could have raised his hand all 3 times. Frazier had 3 wars with Ali, beating him 1 out of the 3. George knocked those guys out easily, devastating knockouts, and Ali beats George. So that's what heavyweights would do to each other. You can never say, oh, this guy will beat that guy because he beat the guy that beat him. No,